The discussion this evening will inform Neighbourhood Planners.London's thinking about how we might respond to the planning reforms, but we will be drafting something, ahead of the consultation date, and I'm sure sharing and circulating that in a draft form for others to feed in, or for further comments from people participating. Just a reminder of a few sort of the metrics in London. So we have 17 made neighbourhood plans in London. There's a few more at examination or awaiting referendum for when referendums are allowed to happen. And there are still a small number of neighbourhood forums coming forward to be designated. So the process has new people entering, as well as some plans being through the process. And quite a lot now of groups are re-registering because they've been around for 5 years or more, about 80 designated forums across the capital. We will be producing, some of you who are on the earlier call a month or two back know that we shared sort of the results, or the early results, of some work we've done on local authority attitudes to forums being designated, and that work, which Henry's leading on, will be published fairly soon. We're just navigating a local authority that wasn't quite as keen on our judgment about it as we thought. So we just want to try and smooth that as much as we can. We've had, since we last came together, a bit of a disappointing response to what was a pretty helpful report from the Greater London Assembly, but the Mayor's response to that perhaps could have gone more strongly. And we are looking again at how the Mayor gets involved, and we've got now details of how all the Mayor's interventions on neighbourhood plans, so we're having a good look at that. The good news since we last met is that our recommendations being picked up by government, that neighbourhood forums should be have access to the full funding that's available under the Neighbourhood Planning Support Programme, and also the full range of technical support. So all neighbourhood forums, and also others who are in deprived areas, can now access that funding. So that basically makes another £8,000 available to neighbourhood forums. From the original £10,000 threshold, now £18,000 is available. So if you had spent out your earlier allocation, that funding is now increased, that headroom. Key message for me is keep going. Use the extra support. Of course, these are uncertain times for all sorts of reasons, but we're achieving a lot through neighbourhood planning in London, and the volunteer effort is paying back, despite some difficult headwinds. And that brings us to the reforms, which clearly are one of the sort of unknowns about the future, and their implications, in particular for neighbourhood planning. I would encourage us if we could just try and focus on the neighbourhood planning dimensions of the reforms, because obviously they're quite interesting in all sorts of other ways for those who are interested in planning. But it would be particularly useful for this evening if we could focus on the neighbourhood planning aspects of what we know and what we don't know. So I'm going to hand over now to Jen Beresford from MHCLG, and that will be followed by Dave and by Steve. Jen.
Yeah, so good evening, everyone. My name's Jen Beresford. I'm part of the Neighbourhood Plans team at MHCLG. I just want to thank, first of all, Tony and Neighbourhood Planners.London for inviting me to speak at this session and to attend it. I'm sure it'll be really interesting and hopefully quite informative for you guys as well, to hear a little bit more about the planning reforms, well, the proposed planning reforms, and their impacts on neighbourhood planning. As you'll likely be aware, neighbourhood planning is a lot more prominent in parish areas, and so it's particularly useful for myself and my team to hear your comments and discussions from a perspective of forums in a city. And we do very much want to ensure we're engaging with a wide range of stakeholders and getting representative feedback from all across England, and, as mentioned earlier, sort of including urban, rural areas and also deprived areas. So I guess in terms of the discussion today, I'd like to spend a few minutes outlining some of the key proposals from the Planning for the Future consultation, obviously with a focus on those that are most relevant for neighbourhood planning. Before I start, I would like to emphasise that these are very much proposals, and we're in the early stages. So what is key for us, we really do want to hear your feedback. And obviously, as Tony mentioned, the group's going to provide a response to our consultation, which closes on the 29th of October. So that will be really helpful, and also any sort of intel in the discussion from today will be really useful as well for us. So I guess firstly, and perhaps the area that you might most be interested to hear about, is the proposed change to the area-based approach for local plans. So this would basically mean that local plans categorise all land as land for either growth, renewal or protection. So with growth areas, you would have outline planning permission for the uses that are specified in the plan. Obviously, the aim for this is greater speed and certainty for everyone involved in the process. And then in terms of renewal areas, these are mostly covering existing urban areas, and then development would be allowed to proceed based on either like a design code or a pattern-based typology. But if these didn't apply, development would still need planning approval in the usual way, as will all proposals in protected areas. And then finally, in terms of protected areas, these are areas which there is recognised constraints. So for example, national parks, green belt, and open countryside, which it doesn't slot into the other two categories. There's also a key focus on bettering engagement throughout the white paper proposals. And we believe that the best way to bring forward new and significant development is by improving community engagement at an earlier stage in the process. So for example, the best place to consider the strategic use of land would be perhaps at the local plan stage, and setting these questions at the outset would give greater certainty to communities and developers. We also feel that there should be a maintained role for neighbourhood planning as an important aspect of the planning system. And again, I'll talk about this a little bit further in a couple of minutes. And also that communities could play a part of place shaping through engagement on local design codes. Next, there's also a focus on beauty with the proposals of a fast track for beauty. This would grant automatic planning permission for certain development that's in accordance with design codes and standards. And again, there's also the emphasis on design codes to be set locally and to guide development to shape communities. And then sort of touching upon also developer contributions, where the white paper proposes replacing these in order to remove negotiation and provide greater clarity and certainty, both for developers and communities. Both those aspects aren't sort of my key area of work, so if you do have questions on those, happy to try and answer them, but it might be something I have to take back with me. And then also, if you've had a chance to read the consultation yet, you'll have noticed that there is a big focus on digitalisation of the planning system. So the current system in England is now about 7 decades old, and as such, it doesn't necessarily take into account the modern society and economy as well as it could. So the idea of a digital move is seen as a particular opportunity for engagement from our perspective, and it could encourage wider communities to become more involved in planning through convenient and easy access to online documents and sources, design and building codes, and also create a more visual understanding of how development will look. So for example, 3D visualization, so communities can perhaps get a better understanding of how a particular site or building might fit into the area. And it would also, on this note, it would also be helpful perhaps later on in the discussion to hear any comments you might have on moving neighbourhood planning towards a more digital world, because we're aware that neighbourhood planning groups may not always have, I guess, the specific technical knowledge or access to software for digital means at the moment. And so any kind of support that might be needed for groups and also to engage the wider community would be particularly helpful for us to hear. And then I guess now I'm just going to go on to the more specific neighbourhood planning proposals, and sort of starting those off by saying that government does very much recognise the important role that neighbourhood plans play in the current system. So we as a department know the positive impact they can have on engaging the community in planning, and also in allocating locally acceptable sites for development. As well as focusing on the elements that individual communities need and value the most. So for example, in one area, affordable housing might be a particular issue, and communities can work that into their neighbourhood plans. So that's why government is committed to retaining and encouraging their take-up where communities see this as a best fit for them and the best way to achieve their place-based goals. What we do want to consider further, and where I hope this discussion will kind of provide me with further intel from a forum perspective, is whether neighbourhood plans should be more focused to reflect the proposals for local plans, and also other objectives, for example, design. And as mentioned previously, how the potential of digital tools and data can be exploited to make them more accessible and engaging to the wider community. We want to make the process simpler for groups. We know that we've basically heard from groups that sometimes the process, some elements can be quite burdensome at the moment, and also there can be some difficulties like aligning it with the local plan. And so I'd just like to hear, I guess, a little bit more your thoughts on that and how we can sort of align a better relationship to make things a bit more streamlined. And we also know that currently the relationship with the local planning authority can impact on the success and ease with which plans are developed. And so we'd also like to improve consistency in that area. So I guess that's the main kind of high level proposals from me. And I'd be very interested to hear what comes out of the further discussion later on.
Jen, thank you.
Thank you.
I'll go straight on to Dave.
Okay, thanks. Okay, just to say a little more about some of those themes that were introduced at the beginning there. One of the things that I noted really in the white paper, it very much emphasised democratising the planning system, and I think neighbourhood planning is one of the ways actually that planning has been democratised. There's been far greater emphasis on participation, and from early stages, obviously you've got the referendum as well, but neighbourhood planning in many ways I think has led the way in terms of making planning more accessible and more democratic. What the white paper hasn't done, I think, is recognise how neighbourhood plans have actually, some of them have been quite innovative in enabling higher levels of growth, and that's not just through site allocations, although that's important as well, but also use of policies to try and create the conditions to attract investment, particularly around the high street, town centres, city centres. We've seen some quite creative policies in neighbourhood plans and around employment as well, and recognising changes in employment patterns. I think all of these things are obviously really key issues at the moment, and obviously we're seeing temporary changes in things like live-work patterns at the moment, but some of those will stick and some of those aren't just for the, due to current restrictions. Some of those from conversations with clients and stakeholders and groups we're working with, we're going to see, I think, permanent changes in live-work patterns to a significant extent. So I would like to see much more in the white paper recognising that neighbourhood plans can really do useful things in terms of growth. Now, I actually think the way neighbourhood plans are addressed, it doesn't really recognise that the importance that that for many groups the motivation is in achieving growth, and I felt where neighbourhood plans are mentioned, it's very much around design code. So it did seem to suggest that a rather narrower focus for neighbourhood plans, and I think that's regrettable. It's undoubtedly the case that the influence of neighbourhood plans will reduce if these proposals turn into legislation and policy. Some of the ways that will happen is zoning passes very much to the local plan, whereas at the moment there's often a combination of neighbourhood plans and local plans. Less planning applications means that neighbourhood plan policies won't apply in practice because there's no planning application. There's no opportunity for those policies to be applied, and the fact neighbourhood plans seem to be about design codes as well suggests that the thinking is shifting from perhaps the thinking behind the Localism Act 10 years ago to a rather narrower focus. On the zoning system, obviously simplifying the system, you can see the attractions there, and can see the sense in many ways of certain zonings bringing an outline planning permission, but I do have real concerns as well here about the zoning system. The fact that zoning will have to preempt so many considerations that normally would be left to the planning application stage. The developer would pay for information to compile information and for many issues to be addressed, and this does seem to pass that to the local authority and make the local planning process a much more onerous thing. So you know, I've been a planner for more than 3 decades, and there's been constant talk there of shortening the time that it takes for local plans to go through the process. And actually, neighbourhood plans have been one of the ways of bringing policy change and site allocations in more quickly in some instances. So they actually help to make the system more flexible. But I've no doubt that this will slow the local plan process because of the greater depth of consideration the local plan will have to make. I think we're looking at a slower cycle, and from experience of past changes as well. And I don't think that really is recognised in the white paper, which seems to imply there's going to be a faster process there. Just a couple of other issues. Centralisation of policy making. Actually, I think part of the problem at the moment is over-centralised policies, and the fact that national policy is very much based on the assumption of high growth areas where affordability is the issue. So we're working in areas all around the country, including in the southeast and the east of the country, where viability is the issue in actual fact. And I don't feel that's really recognised, particularly in issues around the SIL, where it doesn't really mention viability. Design codes, I think are okay, but it seems to be implied again that this is a replacement for participation at a site and development level, and that's worrying. I think, you know, good design doesn't come out of design codes; it comes out of meaningful interaction and participation. I think there's an idea of early engagement, and codes actually replaces. And I do have a worry as well for the implications of these codes for creativity, and particularly there seems to be the language used in the white paper looks at design very much in stylistic terms rather than perhaps what we'd understand as design issues, which are more around sustainability, how the area works, how it functions, etc. So centralisation of policy making really really worries me. This is a centralising white paper. It passes policy making from local authority to national level, and part of the participatory side of planning, either through planning applications or neighbourhood plans, as a shift towards the zoning system at local authority level. And I've just finished really by saying that centralisation rarely leads to better outcomes.
Thank you, Dave.
Thank you, Dave.
Moving on to Steve Quartermain.
Welcome to this discussion. I'm not going to repeat a lot of what Dave said and Jen's excellent overview. There are just a couple of things I want to try and draw out, which I hope will sort of fuel and help the discussion. The white paper has 3 paragraphs in it about neighbourhood planning. The first one, I would argue, is not particularly relevant. It just says how successful it's been. The last one just says, don't forget digital. So I'd urge you all to read paragraph 2.56, which is arguably then the only paragraph which then says, well, what is the government's view about neighbourhood planning? Now, it talks about it should be retained in a reformed planning system. And bear with me, I'm going to read a bit from it. It's not a very long paragraph. But we would want to consider whether the content should become more focused to reflect our proposals for local plans, as well as the digital. They want to make it easier to develop neighbourhood plans to encourage their continued use and indeed spread their further use. And the final point I want to just highlight is the line that says, we're also interested in whether there is scope to extend and adapt the concept so that very small areas, such as individual streets, can set their own rules. Now, I think these are all things that anybody that's been engaged in neighbourhood planning should reflect on and rise to the challenge of responding to the two questions that then follow in the white paper, which is, do you agree that neighbourhood plans should be retained in the reformed planning system? And how can neighbourhood planning process be developed to meet our objectives, such as the use of digital tools and reflecting the community preferences about design? This is a white paper that I think I'm not judging, and I ought to have said at the very beginning, I remember I stood down from Chief Planner in March. I'm not speaking tonight as Chief Planner or as a representative of the government, but holding a mirror up to what the white paper says. This is a white paper that's big on ideas and is a lot short on some of the detail. And in fairness, they're quite open about that. And they're saying, as part of the consultation, help us fill in the details. This is what we're trying to achieve. Can you respond in the consultation about how you might see this work? So one of my key urges for you tonight is to respond, not necessarily saying whether you think this is a good idea or not a good idea, by all means do that, but also talk about, if you don't think it's a good idea, give the detail as to why and why the existing system might be better or might be amended, or if you think it is a good idea, say what you think it needs to be done to actually be delivered. Because for my reading, there are some good things. Digital has got to be a good thing. Having greater public access to data, planning data on which to base your thinking about plans in your local areas, that's got to be a good idea. It's reassuring to see that the proposals, as I understand them, still retain the proposal that some of the SIL money would be retained at a local level, and that's got to be good. The bits that I think are more challenging, and here I'll say, well, like everybody else, I'm still assessing whether or not it's good or bad. The bits that I think are more challenging is, well, really to be effective and the way the new system is going to operate, you've really got to align your local thinking, your neighbourhood thinking, with the process of adopting a plan. So if a plan is going to have areas identified, growth, renewal and protection, then if, as Dave says, they're arguing that there should be community engagement at an early stage of that process, you've really got to get in there at that stage, because if you don't align your thinking and your local design codes and whatever at that point, then the rules which they talk about, which will follow to govern development in those areas, will be already set. And so there's a challenge, I think, about the alignment of neighbourhood plans and the local plan preparation, particularly when you then look at what the white paper says about local plan preparation, which is the whole job's done in 30 months. So 6 months for a call for sites, a year for the local authority to consider what it's going to do with all this information, and then it submits it, and then it is consultation, a formal consultation that runs onwards. Quite clearly, to be a front-loaded system, that first 18 months has got to have more public engagement. It's not explicit about how that would work, but it is the only way they can have a front-loaded system is to have more engagement in that first 18 months. Now, I think that's quite critical, and I think that we'll need to think about how that can help or hinder neighbourhood plan preparation. Dave mentioned the top-down, the sort of the control thing, and I think it's interesting. There are two things I just wanted to say about that. That on the one hand, you can say, well, if you've got a housing figure set by government, if you've got a local plan which is identifying 3 particular areas, and you've then got the rules that apply to those areas all set in that process, then to what extent can communities then influence and shape that? Now, the answer would appear to be, well, neighbourhood plans can develop their own codes and rules at a local level which will be applied. I come back to my alignment point, but if we can align them, then the issue is, well, to what extent can that actually be delivered? Particularly when at the same time the government is and has been promoting greater permitted development rights, so there are more opportunities for things to be done without planning permission, whether that be converting office to residential or indeed knocking down commercial buildings and rebuilding them as residential, let alone the impact which I think is yet to be played out on the emerging of all the use classes in high streets to create a class E, which is basically put all the retail and business uses that you would normally expect to see in a town centre, all in one class. And the significance of that for people that are doing things at a local level is that, and this apologies, this may sound a bit technical, but it's important that it's understood that development is defined as a change between two use classes. Now, if everything's in one use class, there is no development when there is changes within that use class. So if you change from a retail to a business use, that isn't development if it's all in one use class. That means it's nothing to do with planning. It's not development. So therefore, you can't have a policy for it. You can't use an Article 4. You can't condition against it. It's nothing to do with planning. You don't need permission. And so it's not development. So I think it's quite an important issue there, because it does seem to run contrary to, we want a local voice, we want a local influence, we want local design codes. And over here, there's some things being sort of established, which would arguably mean it's more difficult for communities to say that. And I'm particularly interested with your views on this idea of creating it at a lower level, street by street. I mean, to be frank, it's you could argue that the process of trying to get neighbourhood forums together to agree an area that's going to be covered and to have a coherent approach to that, and the process you need to go through to get local authorities to support it. And one of the earlier questions was very much about how do we actually get councils to really embrace neighbourhood planning. And if you then start to break that down into street by street, you think, well, how is this going to work? My final point was just to come back on the areas. I think it's not clear, Dave, and I think that the answer may well be it will vary from place to place as to whether the zoning. I try and avoid the Z word because they're very clear it's not a zoning system. But if you have area allocated for 3 different types of use, the degree to which that's going to be broad brush, a sort of here be renewal, and I suppose you could say that if that's not dissimilar to drawing settlement limits around places and saying within that settlement limit there's a permissive policy to allow development. And to what extent it's going to be a patchwork of very specific allocations throughout the built-up area. So you'll get areas of protection, areas of renewal, areas of growth, sort of pepper potted around within it. And it's not clear. And I think the answer could be, it could be both. Both could actually emerge. And that then picks up the fact that if it is more of a pepper potting, then you can see that within certain areas, you could easily find protection for conservation areas, listed buildings and the like arising, because if you can have a sub area within an area, that's how you would do it. And certainly the white paper does make it clear that things like high streets and business areas can be specifically identified within this approach. So there does seem to be sort of an opening for that sort of approach. But it's I suppose my conclusion is sort of this is an opportunity to try and shape the way this goes forward, and I would urge people to respond to the consultation so that if you have a message, that it's heard loud and clear.
Andrew, I don't know if you pulled out anything particularly that you want to draw attention to. I've got 4 which I've spotted, or 4 themes.
I have actually one question just for clarity before we start the discussion. What is the timeline for the new system? So what is the expectation of a new system sort of emerging in front of us? Is it another year or 2, or is it 4 years? And that's a question, I think, for all panel members. That'd be my first one, just to put us a little bit on a sort of, literally timeline. And I wonder if maybe Jen, if you have a sort of an overview for us on that. Yes.
Sorry, just unmuted. So I don't have a specific timeline to offer at the moment. I mean, one thing to say is it's definitely not something that's going to happen overnight. I wouldn't basically, stop plans or what people are doing because they're concerned about it, for example, because it is going to be still quite a lengthy process. This is, like I mentioned, only the very beginning and only our sort of initial thoughts and proposals. We still have to narrow that down into more detailed design. We should have a better idea once we have analysed the responses to the consultation, and when we do our government, well, when the government response comes out, we should have a clearer idea then.
Okay, thank you for that. I wonder if I also could get David briefly with your 30 years of planning experience. Sorry, I'm putting you on the spot there. In terms of how do you, from your point of view, how long would such a wholesome, complete rewriting of legislation and so on actually take?
Well, I probably can't really add anything of substance to MHCLG's response there. But obviously, you've got primary legislation for some of these changes. Then you've got the secondary legislation, policy changes, etc. So, judging by things like the Localism Act, there's a few years really before the. In fact, I think I'm not sure all the Localism Act has yet been enacted actually, but you're looking a few years, but with some changes happening more quickly than others. I knew it was a mistake to mention 3 decades in planning.
And I see on the chat, Lorraine is pointing out quite rightly that the use class order has basically got changed overnight quite substantially, with I guess impacts on what you mentioned earlier around high streets and policy, in the ability to actually write new policies for high streets. Tony, could I hand over to you for a second? Because if you have 4 points that you gathered, and I shall do that by, bear one second with me. So I put Tony back onto Spotlight, and I probably should mute Dave. Sorry, I talk you through my actions here. Tony, over to you.
Yeah, so some of the themes that are coming out, and I know we've also got a couple of people who've asked to speak as well. One is there seems to be confusion and differences of view as to whether conservation areas are automatically protected or not. We also have the issue of metropolitan open land in London, which is a distinct sort of version of Greenbelt, and examples of where we've got conservation areas, in opportunity areas. So that the sort of the complexity of that is apparent. There's a set of questions around whether the skills and resources exist in neighbourhood forums to sort of take on these roles. I suppose implicit in that is, or how can you get them? So is the neighbourhood planning support programme, for example, enough? What could be done there? There's a question around, so let's assume all this gets implemented, what's the role of neighbourhood planning in growth or renewal areas? Will it be possible for neighbourhood plans to allocate sites? What flexibility is there for neighbourhood plans to have policies, if all those policies are going to be dealt with at the national level? And then there's a comment around whether neighbourhood planning can itself take on the sort of zoning system. Could you see a neighbourhood plan being the vehicle, or given that neighbourhood plans currently, this is me adding, anticipate local plans in many places, they don't just follow, it isn't sort of that linear approach. What's the role of neighbourhood plans being the vehicle through which these zones, if that's what we're going to call them, are decided? I don't know if we should quickly go around the panel and then maybe go to Henry, because I know he's got a couple of thoughts on that.
Yeah. Steve, would you want to kick us off and picking one of the questions? If I unmute you, yeah, here we are.
To be honest, no. I'm going to, lots of the questions there really need to be answered initially from Jen, who's doing an excellent job in fielding this, but these are initially questions for government. I'm quite happy to comment on the issue, but as I said at the beginning, I'm not here representing the government's white paper. Jen is. So we need to start with Jen's response to this, I'm afraid.
Okay, very good. Thank you. Gave me a bit more time. There you go.
Hey, so I guess starting off on the growth areas aspect, I think, again, it's mentioning that these are very high level proposals. There are also mentions in the white paper of like the potential for sub areas. What we, I guess, really want to know is, do people still, or like, do neighbourhood groups still want, like, what powers do they want in terms of site? Do they want to still allocate sites in neighbourhood plans? Some groups may think that it's too complicated and they would rather input through a local plan. Other groups might say that they very much want to continue the role of allocating sites. So I guess it's just, you know, this is where we're asking for your feedback. In terms of what you think neighbourhood plans should be able to do in the new system and how you think that they would best be aligned with local plans. So that would be my initial response to that one. On the conservation areas, I believe my colleague Chris, who is also on this call as well, from sort of both perspectives, has posted a part of the white paper proposal, which includes conservation areas in there. Again, it's saying that these are, you know, these are very early proposals, and getting your thoughts on it would be very helpful. Chris, feel free to jump in if you have anything to add, but I think those were the main ones for me. Feel free to ask if there was anything else that I missed.
Tony had on his list one around, well, we have you online now, around the role of neighbourhood forums, to how they can influence growth and opportunity areas.
Yeah, so I think that kind of relates back to my first point. It's whether it's gaining people's feedback on, is it, for instance, something that would be better as engagement through the local plan? So would neighbourhood groups see it as more efficient to maybe engage earlier on in the stages of the local plan to help identify these areas? Or would it be a case that neighbourhood plans still very much want to have sort of their own individual say, if that makes sense? But again, early feedback is what we're seeking.
Okay. Tony, can you let me know if there's anything else on the chat that we could cover while we have Jen on the spotlight, basically?
I think we should probably get some other comments on that and maybe bring Henry in as well.
Okay, great.
Angela, I'm happy to sort of say a couple of things if it helps, and to try and help the flow. I mean, I think that what Jen's answer shows is that the government doesn't know the answer to some of these things. So it's a genuine consultation and saying, how do you want this to work? Which is why I come back to my point about you need to make sure your voice is heard. If, in a way, if you have a question that says, how will neighbourhood plans influence how a particular site might be used in an area, then you should turn that around into a response you make to the government to say, we think that we need to have control over over the sites, how the sites are used. So therefore, if you're going to design a system, it needs to do X, Y, and Z. Because I think that that's the approach I'm urging you to think about. There is an issue about alignment. Jen mentioned it again in her response. Yeah, ideally, wouldn't it be great if there was a year zero and everyone started their plan making and all began to think about this, and then 30 months later we not only had a local plan but had all the neighbourhood planning that went with it. The reality is, call me a skeptic, but I'm not convinced that that's going to happen. So if that's not going to happen, then you need to think about, well, how does that work? I do think that there's a lot of emphasis on codes, design codes and pattern books, and that's what the white paper talks about. I think that you need to think about, well, how does that work? Can you use codes, for example, within a growth area to say, okay, I know this is a growth area or indeed a renewal area, but these are the rules we want to apply in here. So if you're going to bring forward development in this particular area, as a neighbourhood forum, this is our thoughts about how this development should take place. And these are the rules that we would like. And therefore, this is in our neighbourhood plan, because we're going to say this is the rules that apply. So it's not so much about site allocations as such, potentially. And I said the details there to be fought for. But if you're not going to get to decide which area is growth, which area is renewal, then I suppose the offer on the table is you can decide how that goes forward. So how that renewal area is renewed and how that growth area grows. And obviously that's I think the sort of the subtext of the white paper. Is there a reformed role, and that's why I emphasize reading from the text, a more focused role for neighbourhood plans. So you've already got a system that deals with which bits of land are allocated for the 3 types of area, because that's what they're saying the local plan process will do. So the neighbourhood plan area won't deallocate or reallocate those uses, but what it will do potentially is influence how those areas are actually developed and brought forward. And that's what I think that my reading of that. So there's a bit about curatorship and how you can curate the way in which those areas come forward. To pick up your earlier point, Tony, there's a real issue about how you can then harness the skills that you need to be able to do that. I think there's a big question about whether there's going to be the skills and resources in local government to do the system in the first place, let alone how it will cascade into lower levels. But that's I mean, I'm hoping I'm giving people food for thought here.
Thank you very much. Dave, do you want to comment on this as well then, if I may?
Yeah, a few comments really. So obviously we work with an awful lot of neighbourhood plans, and a lot of the groups actually are making representations on the local plan and trying to influence things like strategic site allocations in parallel to doing the neighbourhood plan. And a lot of groups are choosing to do site allocations. But I would emphasise as well, site allocations aren't the only way of enabling growth, particularly in complex areas. Policy can be a way of enabling growth as well, and can have quite a high impact on that. On the zoning system, heritage is interesting because it's probably the area that fits in at least. Do you know, there's something flashing behind me? I think it's a reflection off the headphones. But heritage probably fits least well. It's down in the paper as protect, but as we know, many historic areas are city centres, town centres, commercial areas, industrial, areas going through quite significant change and transformation, and that if anything, that's going to accelerate over the next few years. So I think it's really important to understand heritage is not just a protect issue, but in many areas it's part of the way of putting the foot down on the accelerator and getting investment into the area. The other point I just wanted to raise is there is this question in the plan of where you can relate to streets or areas, but many neighbourhood plans actually do that, and they have area-wide policies, but also area-specific policies or policies relating to a particular street. So I wasn't actually sure what the white paper was introducing that was different there. That seemed to me to be an embedded part of neighbourhood plan practice.
Okay, super. I gather we're getting more and more questions the longer time we spend on the matter. And I will now bring in Henry, who has thought quite a little bit about site allocations, possible or not possible. I think that might be one of the things that you will at least start off your commentary, I believe.
Yes, and I would just like to sort of pin things down on this, because when the white paper was first published, I listened to a landmark Chambers online seminar where all the barristers were saying, well, that's the end of site allocations in neighbourhood plans. But I mean, I've been hoping that once the zoning exercise is completed, it will still be possible for a neighbourhood plan to allocate a specific site, saying this is a very good small site for housing or for social and community use or whatever. I would also hope that it will be possible to vary policies and to fine-tune them at a neighbourhood level. The neighbourhood forum I've chaired for the last 8 years has a made plan. It's in North Kensington. We allocated sites, we allocated local green spaces. We also varied council policies, which we thought over-restrictive in a one-street employment zone, to allow for more mixed use and to introduce some housing. We are now working with Kensington and Chelsea Council on a design code for that one street, dealing with issues like height and site coverage and building lines and all the sort of things you'd expect to see in a design code. I'm not quite clear how that process is going to conclude. The council thinks it's going to do it as an SPD. We could do it as an add-on to the neighbourhood plan. I think residents feel somehow that they will very definitely have their say and have some decision-making process at the end of it. But short of mini street referendums, I'm not quite sure how that will work, unless there is some form of simpler version of a poll or something which helps get that design code having some assured, very local support.
I think that's a very important point you make there around the scale of policy, because you, in the current system, you developed a neighborhood plan, and you're now developing a design code on a much more detailed level, which requires lots of information, lots of understanding. And there is probably a question around where will that knowledge sit in the future, and is it then aligned with the level who makes policy? I'd like to ask you actually another question on this. In London, we obviously have our London plan. Have you found anything in the white paper that helps us to understand how that would all work together with that London plan in between?
No, nothing. And the new London plan has much more detailed policy than the old London plan, or the current London plan, as it still is. Neighbourhood Planners.London have long asked, are London plan policies now venturing into non-strategic territory? And we raised this at the examination many moons ago. And I would love to know from MHC whether the distinction between strategic and non-strategic policies and the general conformity principle remains at all in this plan you set up, or whether all of that is now out of the window. Because I think we would still want a neighbourhood plan that can develop non-strategic policies in quite a lot of detail on things like conservation, which matter to people, and for those to have some impact as material considerations on decision making. And if you take all that away, I think it is very hard to get the public to engage at the strategic zoning stage, because they don't understand the real impact that might have on their street and on their neighbours. And it's a difficult thing to do at that high level strategic stage.
I think I would like to bring Jen in on this, but we obviously have heard about the invitation to comment and provide feedback on the white paper on the early days. But perhaps, Jen, if you have a few thoughts on Henry's commentary for us, I shall unmute you. Are we playing a bit catch up? Well, apologies. And I will put you on a spotlight. Here we go.
Thanks. So first of all, just to say, kind of strategic plans and at the London level are not something I work on directly. Obviously, you know, they are very much linked. So I'm happy to take that feedback back, both from a neighbourhood planning perspective and on the sort of more strategic level. I guess all we can really say at the minute is that we're engaging with a number of stakeholders, including mayor-led combined authorities and the GLA on strategic planning, and thinking about how that can be delivered under the new system. And so, yeah, that's our main sort of early thoughts on that at the minute. And it's a lot to do with, we are still engaging with stakeholders, but I will take those points back with me.
Mm-hmm. Sort of coming a little bit back to what David said earlier around heritage. In many ways, London is heritage. Almost in every part of London, every part of the neighbourhood in London, we deal with heritage matters. And they often do, the local communities care very much about heritage and about the quality of the buildings. Is there consideration from your point of view how this could be aligned, because it doesn't really, we had a conversation earlier on the chat about conservation areas, and I think Chris pointed out they are going to be part of the protected zones. Is that something that has been more work done, or will there be more work done? What that means for urban areas?
Sorry, would you mind just re-clarifying the question there? Sorry.
So we have in London quite a few conservation areas, and I think earlier in the chat it was pointed, there was a question asked, are conservation areas part of the protected zones? Okay.
Yeah, so as Chris posted in the chat from the planning proposals, I mean, the proposals are that they would be included in it, within it. Okay. But again, as mentioned, it's all just proposals at the moment, so still happy to hear feedback.
Okay, great, thank you. Tony, could I bring you back now, because you had a chance to go through the chat and maybe picked up some more questions for the panel?
Yeah, I mean, Jen's asked a question about digital, which people may want to respond to. There's also if we are going to be more nested and basically neighbourhood plans following local plans and local plans making those decisions, as Steve, identified, the questions being asked. So how can the local plan making process learn from the quality of engagement that's been able to be achieved by neighbourhood plans? So can we take some of that and put it in upstream? And lessons, because often, as many people on this call will know, there's a sort of quality of conversation that takes place at neighbourhood plan level, which just isn't there at a local plan level. So how can we share that? Those are 2 points which have come up recently. Design codes, is another point, although that's relatively well covered in the document. There's probably more on design codes than almost anything else. And I know that Neil also wanted to come in, Angela. So we might want to go to Neil relatively soon.
Yeah, I'm finding there's Neil. I can unmute Neil Homer. Neil, could you speak for a little moment so I can see you on my screen?
Hello.
Hi there. Do you have your camera on by any chance?
Yeah. My little green light's flashing.
I'm afraid I can't find you.
The beautiful looking one at the bottom.
Yeah. How about if I try to find you so we have a lovely visual of you, but you could obviously speak to us while I'm doing that.
Of course.
Is that okay?
No problem.
Thank you, Neil.
Well, thank you. Thanks for just giving me a little moment to say a couple of things. So we're sort of bringing our experience of 150 neighbourhood plans that we've helped as a consultancy over the last 8 years, including some in London, and I've seen that colleagues at North Kingston and Central Acton and Kennington Oval, Vauxhall are on the call tonight, so it's good. I think what Jen needs to know is that there are already neighbourhood plan projects that have put themselves on hold because they are uncertain of the future, and I'm not going to restart until the outcome of the white paper is known next year, and that almost every steering group agenda that we have participated in over the last 6-7 weeks has been dominated by the white paper instead of talking about what they're actually up to, and even prospects, those projects that are looking to appoint some advice from the people like us have also spent most of the time talking about the white paper. So it's already had a negative effect in terms of the uncertainty that it's brought to local communities, either already embarked on plans or thinking about neighbourhood plans. And I think the reason for that is that the content of the white paper is stark. I'm usually a glass half full person, but I've been taught to read white papers in what they say and not what I would like to think that they say. And Henry, I don't think that you would be able to bring forward your made neighbourhood plan now in this white paper world, because I think you quite rightly, and others have spotted, Dave as well, that the white paper makes no provision, explicitly no provision for neighbourhood plans to do the sorts of things that you and many others have done in hugely compelling ways over the last 8 years. And I've really taught a lot of local planning authorities a few lessons on what engagement actually means and how to innovate in policy terms. And the white paper does not allow for that. I don't think it's good enough, to be perfectly honest, to put out these ideas without having thought them through or to think about the consequences, because it is having an effect. I think that, as I've blogged for the RTPI very recently, that this is snatching defeat from the jaws of victory. There is more than enough compelling evidence from those of us that do this as a day job. Dave will have seen more projects than we have. There's compelling evidence that neighbourhood planning works, even though quite a few local planning authorities are still haven't quite got it. Many more, an increasing number of local planning authorities certainly have, and those that we know quite well that we've talked to are worried too about the consequences of the white paper, in not being allowed to sort of share the burden, if you like, in local and neighbourhood plan, local spatial policy making, if we call it that. There are some districts, some local planning authority areas in the country, what we call the hotspots of neighbourhood planning, that will find it very problematic to be able to use these three different characterisations. I agree with Steve that the Z word shouldn't really enter the conversation. That will really struggle in 42 months or longer, let alone 30 months, because they've become used to neighbourhood plannings filling that space, neighbourhood planning plans filling that space. And it was interesting how much of the local plan expert group's recommendations that were really spot on, I thought, 4 years ago, how few of those have made it through into this white paper. This issue about strategic and non-strategic, and how neighbourhood plans could be encouraged and enabled in urban and rural areas to play a much greater part of the plan making activity. And I think it's to finish with, really, I think that there's no way that the white paper can be interpreted or promoted on the basis of increasing community engagement in the planning system. I can't see how that could possibly be justified in the light of removing most of what neighbourhood plans can do, which is what the white paper says, and at the same time significantly reducing the opportunity for a community to engage with its replacement, this thing called the local planning system, and not to be able to have much of a say at all, if any, at the development management end of the process. So I think we need to be honest about what it is, and if this isn't what the government intended, if what they've written in that white paper isn't what it intended, then I think before we all waste our time firing bullets at this thing over the next 3 or 4 weeks, the government needs to tell us that we've got it wrong, and that this isn't what it meant to say, in the way that it has actually been doing, ministers have been doing in the last 3 or 4 weeks, about things like the standard housing methodology, and backing away from some of that, or at least trying to interpret more than the white paper actually said. And I think as a community of neighbourhood planners, we'd all benefit from that, because I don't want to waste my time and invest time with clients that could be so much better invested in other more productive ways, if this isn't the scary thing that we think it is. If we've all sort of got the wrong end of the stick and it's not the scary thing.
Yeah.
No. Rant finished.
Thank you, Neil. Tony, could I bring you in as a response to this, maybe because in a way there was a bit of a call for action as well in terms of getting organized and coordinated in a response. But I also, can I ask the whole audience to think a little bit about because I think Eileen Conn asked that earlier, what happens actually to the areas who will not have a neighbourhood plan in this sort of environment of a potential completely reformed or let's say changed planning system. But Tony, I'd like to bring you in first.
Sure. I mean, I'm tempted to comment on that. I mean, obviously, at one level, it's the same as it is now. If you haven't got a neighbourhood plan, you've just got fewer chances to have a say. The chances of enough is for others to judge, I guess. But there's nothing in any of this which suggests we shouldn't continue to try and do neighbourhood planning. The ability to influence is obviously going to be shaped by whatever the outcome of the proposals is. In terms of your point around action, I mean, Steve, I think, is giving us a very clear steer around let's be clear about what we think should happen. Let's exploit the uncertainty, fill the vacuum, demonstrate the value of what's been done to date, and demonstrate what it can do in the future. I mean, obviously we're right to keep asking questions, but we also need to be putting forward proposals and I guess that's what we need to do as a group following this conversation, and we'll be crafting something which people have a chance to feed into around that, but I think it needs to be on the basis of a confidence in what can be achieved, and an alignment with trying to secure the influence. So I think we all want almost whatever the ground rules are that are being established, and clearly we don't know all the detail on what those ground rules are because the white paper is quite sketchy on some of them. On other issues, Angela, Simon Burkett, I think, would like to come in on conservation areas, because it seems he's got other information which might be worth seeing if we can run this particular one to the ground as to whether they are or not included. I would just say, in response to some of the points in the chat, protected areas don't mean they're protected in the sense that nothing will change. Protected areas will continue to have a planning application process like we have now, so you'll continue to have to develop in protected areas. It just won't have the kind of zoning approach which fast tracks things. But you might want to bring Simon in.
Yeah, so Simon, I think might have found you. I think we can hear you, Simon.
All right, thank you.
Super.
Thank you.
Maybe if you could start your contribution, I will see if I can get a video of you as well, if I may.
Okay. Thank you very much, all of you, and conveners for organising this great session, and the speakers you've got. I attended the session that Jen ran for the ministry, I think it was last Friday, Jen, which was a really excellent session. And during that, one of the officials confirmed that the conservation areas would not, repeat not, automatically be included in the protected areas, that it would be something that would be resolved between national policy and what local authorities want, and I assume with input from forums. So I declare I'm in favour of having conservation areas automatically presumed to be in, unless there's a good reason for being out of protected areas to ensure that there's a planning application process. The only other thing I would say, apart from just agreeing with everything that people have said already from forums, which I think are excellent comments, is that in that ministry session which I attended, one of the things which I asked for to give a real purpose to the neighbourhood forums, because I am concerned that if our role is only to lead on pattern books, it's not a very exciting life. What I thought would be great is if we would be able to put forward policies or proposals which are stronger or more ambitious. More ambitious is what I really mean, than the ones that will appear in the revised NPPF. And I'm thinking in particular on environmental policies, where, for example, the Knightsbridge Neighbourhood Forum points to zero air emissions now from buildings rather than net zero in 2050. Thank you for letting me say something.
The thing in the chat about how ambitious the white paper is on radically reshaping what community engagement is in the planning system. And what I said to 150 odd parish councils a few weeks ago, last week, was that what I've seen from neighbourhood planning is a level and a depth in community engagement that is miles better than what the local planning authorities do for local plans. And I think this is a really good opportunity for the neighbourhood planning movement to make that clear to government, talk about some of the ways that it has engaged with communities, and look to kind of maybe sort of hardwire some of that into the local plan system. Because at the moment, what you get is a 6-week window to look at thousands of documents which are incredibly complicated and difficult to understand. And what's been proposed in the white paper is potentially a 6-month period of intensive engagement. And and it's the experience of neighbourhood planners around the country that can really help us figure out, how best, what sort of level of detail we should put on what should happen in that local plan engagement period with the community. So, I mean, that's just something that I think is really important. and it's something that I think local planning authorities can learn a lot from the neighbourhood planning groups. And then I wanted to say something else around when Neil was talking about neighbourhood planning groups pausing. So I think the message here from government is the same for local planning authorities and their local plans, and for community groups on the neighbourhood plans. It is to carry on. We don't have an exact deadline. The white paper talks about the possibility of new local plans coming into force at the end of the Parliament, which is another 4 years or so away. It's not clear yet whether that will be all plans or whether that will be one or two kind of, trailblazers, but still, it's years and years off new local plans coming into place. And then what you've got there is a big, if you stop now, you've got a big vacuum, a void without planning policies in place. So we would definitely urge neighbourhood planning groups to continue. Tony's already mentioned around some of the changes to make the support contract better. And I know it's tricky, and I know we are in a period of uncertainty, but that was always going to be the case with planning reform. And then just to reiterate what others have said, there isn't much detail on neighbourhood planning, but there isn't much detail on the kind of high-level tier strategic planning as well. There's lots of big gaps in the white paper, and we want the neighbourhood planning groups around the country to help us fill those gaps. And the more you tell us and the more positive ideas you give us, then the better opportunity we've got to shape a better neighbourhood planning system in the future.
Okay, thank you, Chris. I think that that timeline information, I think, is quite relevant for quite a lot of us, because I hear a lot of concern and I see a lot of agendas where things are discussed, which is important, but there are so many other aspects that as you know, volunteer groups have to kind of deal with on a day-to-day. So that's a good point made. And I shall take the spotlight off you, if I may, and bring Tony back.
I think Lorraine Hart wanted to make a contribution. So maybe we'll bring Lorraine in rather than hearing more from me.
Yeah. Okay. So so Lorraine is unmuted already. Wonderful. And I put in a spotlight. Hi, Lorraine.
Thank you. Like Neil Homer, I'm a consultant. I did have an involvement in my local area with the Neighbourhood Plan Forum, which ran into the sand in terms of people's energy. But I wanted to say, really, partly underlining what the MHCLG people have been saying about the numbers of gaps in the white paper. And I do see the role of a network like this and people like myself who've had experience across a lot of different neighbourhood plans, including very rural areas, very protected areas, as saying what we think neighbourhood planning should look like. And if that means that we start reformulating policy in terms of these are the policies that encourage growth. I think the point that Dave Chetwyn made about policies doing that, not just site allocations, and talking about policies that protect and talking about policies that renew, I don't see any reason why that couldn't sit well with, regardless of the gaps, the fact that I'd always thought we are responsible for the lowest level of local statutory plans. And so the ones that have been made should stand, and the ones that are to be created can accommodate ambitions for growth, because all communities need housing, all communities need jobs, all communities need local services, and we're the ones with the local knowledge that can make that happen. So I do see this as an opportunity. If it turns out that the big cynic in me is right, fine, but what am I going to do? Just stop trying to improve my neighbourhood and help other people improve their neighbourhoods? So I do think that we need to formulate responses to this consultation that are about taking some of the larger strategic ideas, because I thought neighbourhood planning was always about the fine grain of local plan policy, where there will be little misnomers. There will be little things that local people say, this is important to us. This is going to have this policy associated with it. So I just wanted to encourage people to think about turning their current thinking around neighbourhood planning into the mindset that government have clearly got, which is about freeing up development, sometimes in very unpositive ways, but also keeping the focus consultation local. Because I think, and I said in the chat box, the problem with front-ending consultation on local plans is that it's very difficult for people to engage at a district-wide level in issues. It's much more easy for them to be creative about growth and meeting local needs and protection at a very local level too. So anyway, I just wanted to say, I don't think that it's necessarily the case that we take the strategic messages and go, oh my God. We take the strategic messages and instead provide the fine grain in neighbourhood plans and require all local plans to have a consultation statement the way that we have to, which is, this is what people said and this is how we responded in terms of the policy in a plan, because that could turn current community consultation and engagement in local planning on its head. Thank you for letting me speak.
Thank you very much, Lorraine. I think you make a fantastic, important point that sort of the lifeblood of neighbourhood planning is the lived experience and the care that people have for their area. And that's where their confidence comes from to contribute. And if you then try to copy that onto a district-wide level, into areas, or actually whole borough areas, in London for us, it's sometimes just, 10 streets further down. We really don't know those areas. So there's an issue of confidence, I think, that needs to be addressed. And that might actually make, on a local plan level, as you say, contributions much more questionable and probably selective as well.
I'm going to go back to each of the three panelists who presented earlier, and just ask for their observations or reflections on what they've heard, maybe a couple of minutes each, and then I'll just round things up after they've spoken. But do keep filling the chat with comments or indeed questions, or anything you want us to be reflecting on as we think about how to respond. I'm going to go in the same order as we did before. So Jen, then Dave, and final word from the panel to Steve. Jen.
Yeah, fantastic. So,
thanks. I guess I'm kind of like to echo the fact that we would like very much to hear people's views. So, I mean, if possible, it'd be great to have a copy of the chat as well. Again, if there are any questions in there that haven't been answered or that still require further clarity, I'm also happy to take those back and then perhaps send them to you, Tony, with some answers, which can then be fed round. But yes, again, it's just, we're grateful for any feedback we can have from you. And I found it a very interesting session to hear some of your kind of key concerns or key areas that you're not quite sure about. And just sort of finally, again, to reinstate that government is committed to neighbourhood planning, and we do want to see it continue. We just want to find out the best way for this to happen in the new system, because as you'll be aware, it's obviously one part of a wide range of planning reforms. And if we can't necessarily give us detailed answers now, because if one thing changes in another part of the system, that can obviously impact on various areas, which is why we want to get this right now at the sort of high level from everyone's feedback. But yeah, thanks.
Thank you, Jen. Dave?
Okay, just a couple of points, I think, to finish off, and particularly around design codes. I've spent a lot of time advocating front-loaded engagement, the importance of engaging right from the the start. But I do have a worry if that's now seen as a replacement for more detailed engagement at a later stage, and that will go down very, very badly with a whole range of stakeholders and communities, I think. And also the recognition that good design has to be a creative, participatory, problem-solving activity. And I must admit, the way codes are being talked about and codes and rules in local plans does worry me. And a lot of the groups we work with, they're keen on innovation and keen on particularly how we can live in a greener way and looking at design in these ways. And I think codes are kind of missing the point. I do worry as well, they're going to focus on trying to impose some people's aesthetic preferences rather than looking at the fundamentals of sustainable design. So just really a worry there of whether this planning system based around rules, codes and more centralised policy making is actually going to find the solutions to the very, very real problems we're facing at the moment, and also whether it's going to create the towns and cities and neighbourhoods that are exciting and brilliant and inspirational to live in, or whether, you know, we're looking at a sort of squeezing the creativity out of planning.
Thank you, Dave. And
I'm ready to go.
yes, wonderful. Yes, ready.
I'm muted myself. Some random thoughts. Great discussion in the chat box, incidentally. So well done, everybody. But some random thoughts, and then 3 points I want to make. Don't forget that there's a national code coming too. There was design guidance, and then there's a promise of national design code. And then where you don't have a local code, then the suggestion was a national code would apply. So I think that there's that issue to watch for. Second random thought, we're talking about rules, not policies, and so the idea of the 3 areas of allocation, within each area there will be some rules. That's why people talk about codes and pattern books. And so whilst I agree entirely with what Dave said about, you know, sometimes it's a policy rather than a specific allocation which leads to growth and development, then at the moment the words are not that. Timing, I suppose Jen gave a very good attempt at an answer. I suppose nobody knows is the answer, isn't it? But it is going to take primary, it is going to take some secondary. And I think that in that time, and these are the 3 points I want you to ponder. Neil made some really good points about, you know, the lack of detail and what the white paper says. And although I heard what Chris said, and well done, Chris, I think the government is committed, does think neighbourhood planning is important, but actually the white paper doesn't actually say what you said it said, which is it doesn't say the first 6 months will be an intense period of consultation. It actually says the first 6 months will be a period in which the local authority call for sites. Now, there may be an intention that during that period there will be a consultation. That comes back to, and my first point is, comes back to Neil's challenge, which is that you know, if the government needs to be clearer about some of this stuff to reassure people about some of these issues, then that's a pretty good time to be saying so, because without that reassurance, there's going to be some uncertainty, and people will get despondent. The second thing is, obviously, this is an opportunity, isn't it? I like to be a glass half full person. If you've got a neighbourhood plan and you've got, or if you're making one, in the window you've got between now and the new system coming into place, you could argue you're well placed to shape the new plan and to influence what those rules are within those areas. So, you know, to rise to the challenge and make sure that your neighbourhood plan issues and things are in the new system. The third and final point I want to make, though, is just to reiterate, respond to the consultation. Henry, if you've got things in your neighbourhood plan that you think are important to you, and bearing in mind there's a suggestion that DM policies will be lifted out of local plans and be held centrally, but if you want your neighbourhood plan to do something that it does now, then now is the time to say, this is what neighbourhood plans must do. And I think that this is what the value of the forum and the experience you've got sitting around the table, virtual table tonight, is that you know what works, whether it be the public consultation or whether the area policies or where you identify sites. If you want the neighbourhood plans to still do that, then rise to Chris Mountain's challenge and say, this is what we want the white paper to take forward, and this is how we think neighbourhood plans should work.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you, Steve. Thank you. I'm just going to draw things together, and I'm going to start with a quote that's been shared. I want to raise the importance of neighbourhood planning, not to diminish it, to give neighbourhood plans more teeth and more breadth. We spotted that and tweeted it a week or so ago. It's what the Secretary of State is reported to have said to the National Association of Local Councils, and they are obviously responsible, the umbrella, for the parish and town councils, who are the most prolific neighbourhood planning organisations, because if they exist, they're the only people who can do it. We only have one of those in London, so that's why we have our neighbourhood forums. But it is, obviously, there's a, do we believe what people say? But that is the nearest we'll get the kind of reassurance I think that a number of people have touched on, both Neil and Steve there at the end. And so we take that on optimistically. We're Neighbourhood Planners.London. That's kind of what we do. And we'll sort of take that at face value and see what can be done to put neighbourhood planning more front and centre in what emerges. Just a few points from the discussion. It's clear there's a huge amount of uncertainty. The document lacks detail, but not just in this area, although neighbourhood planning does feel a little sort of less detailed even than some other areas. And there's a certain amount of, being in the dark is not great in a system where you're actually dependent on the goodwill and the enthusiasm and the effort night and day of volunteers to make this part of the system really work. So the need to reassure, planning and planners is particularly important, I think, if you want to maintain the momentum against quite difficult headwinds of volunteers, particularly in the challenging environment of a neighbourhood forum in a capital city. And so you can sort of understand why some people are asking the question, and it's been mentioned in the chat box that some are wondering, well, do we actually, have we got the bandwidth, have we got the resources, is now the time to be putting our sort of volunteer effort into this as opposed to other things that we can do for our local area? My answer to that is yes, but I can see why the question is being asked. But we have the opportunity, however, if we take a positive look on what we can achieve here, to say what we think, to learn what we know that we've done better than others in making the planning system work, and setting it out, what we can do, what we must do, and what works, and all the advantages that neighbourhood planning has brought, the way in which planning decisions are being made, the levels of engagement, and the outcomes that are being delivered, the flexibility that's being delivered, the identification of sites that are not currently identified, the support of growth. And in London, there are many locations where the neighbourhood plan is delivering above what the local plan is in terms of support for development. I suspect that's going to also be a conversation about resources and skills available, as well as about the sort of powers that are available to neighbourhood planners. But equally, I think there are lessons that we can feed back into the rest of the system. We've touched already on a couple of those. One around the quality of engagement and the continuous nature of that engagement, and the engagement often at a conversational level, as well as not at a, here's your 8 megabytes of PDFs and we're giving you a very short window in which you're going to respond to it. But also to take advantage of the plans that are in train to inform the plans that aren't yet prepared under the new system, to sort of define the rules of the game that we don't even have yet, through making the plans that we've got in the pipeline really seeing what are neighbourhoods, and to make them so compelling that others are going to respond to them when drawing up other documents and plans. As I said, we will, as Neighbourhood Planners.London, take what we can from this conversation, from other thoughts and previous work that we've done and which people have fed into. As you know, there's various reports and other pieces of activity that we've been involved in, other places we've come together to try and shape a submission that does justice to what neighbourhood planning can do in the capital. We'll share that, so there'll be a chance for everyone to feed into it. and we'll capture the conversation that's been had and selectively, where there are sort of outstanding questions, make sure that we can try and get those questions asked rather than a verbatim sharing of the chat document in response to one of the points that's been made. Tonight's event has been recorded, so we're going to just look at whether that works and how that works and what bits might be useful, but we hope to share that. There have been some other suggestions of other material or podcasts and other things that might also flow from the discussion which this has triggered. It rests really for me to just thank everyone for the richness of the contributions, the quality of the analysis which has already been done, for the enthusiasm that everyone's showing for what we can achieve through neighbourhood planning, to thank the panellists for their insight, and Steve, Dave and Jen, and to thank the conveners who constantly keep working behind the scenes to keep Neighbourhood Planners.London up and running and keep the network going. We'll share the results. There'll be some stuff online, and we'll continue the conversation and share a draft consultation response as soon as we can. But thanks again for your time